U.S. troops have continued to come under fire in Syria and Iraq, but the U.S. is striking back. Is this a dangerous escalation or an underwhelming response to a growing problem? Plus, what is going on in the battle for the Al Shifa hospital and who is ultimately responsible? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's November 13th. This is your unbiased Israel-Hamas update. So real quick, I wanted to give at least the most up-to-date numbers. Now, this is from Al Jazeera, who, for reasons I'm going to talk about in a second, I think are a little bit... who are pretty explicitly pro-Palestine, but I think their numbers are generally accurate. In the conflict, Israel reporting 1,405 KIA with around 6,000 injured and around 11,000 killed in Gaza with about 27,000 injured, as well as you can see the fighting in the West Bank becoming more and more contested, right? Almost 200 killed with 2,400 injured. So increasingly, this looks like a war across all of Israel, not simply a Gaza conflict. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is that, this is from Al Jazeera, which is, they're owned by the Qatari government, right? And Al Jazeera, especially in English, they are very, very pro-Palestinian. Obviously, the Qataris don't exactly host a ton of Palestinian refugees, so they're not, it'd be generous to call them, huge supporters of Palestine or Palestinians. But I wanted to point out something about this. This is the same article where they provide these updates. And as you scroll through, first up, they include a chart describing the healthcare facilities that have been attacked by Israel in Gaza. They include an infographic about the loss of medical services. And this is true. And again, as we've talked about in other videos, it's not right. Civilian medical services should be off limits. Right? It talks about the journalist killed. And then eventually, if you get to the very bottom of the pages, you see that there's an acknowledgement that, yeah, there was a Hamas attack. It says there was 5,000 rockets in the initial barrage. Then it describes fighters crossing Israel in an unprecedented multi-pronged operation through land, air, and sea. Most fighters entered through breaches in the security barriers separating Israel and Gaza. And here's what I think is important. They also say, the surprise attack came after Israeli settlers stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and Palestinians have been killed by the Israelis. All probably true facts. They're missing one of the most important points, right? And it is disingenuous. Right, it talks about gun battles between Israeli forces and Palestinian fighters. Right, there were Israeli air attacks. You can see in this chart here, right, describes Hamas rocket fire, Israeli airstrikes, and gun battles. Now, here's what's really bothersome, is that some of these were gun battles, for sure. Some of them were not. They were targeting civilians. They were massacres. And if you don't understand this, if you don't tell your readers this key piece of information, then the remainder of Israeli behavior looks ghoulish and frightening, right? The New York Times, right, who is pro-Israel, has spilled obviously a ton of ink on it and actually recognized that the Israelis downgraded the number of killed to 1,200, which is, I thought, pretty interesting. They said a lot of it comes to the fact that it's very hard to identify bodies, and that often the Hamas fighters would desecrate the bodies in ways that made identification difficult, burning them or dismembering them, blowing them up, that sort of thing. Right? The vast majority of those killed by Hamas on October 7th, 70%, have been identified as civilians, not soldiers. And don't get me wrong, there is a vast difference. A military operation in which your primary targets are defenseless civilians is not a military operation. That is a terror attack. And this isn't me saying, this isn't a political stance, right? This isn't this is a fact. Your goal was to kill civilians. By and large, right? About a third of the operation did target military targets, legitimate targets in war, right? This would include, police stations, military barracks, military sites, radar, and that sort of thing. But the gun battles when Al Jazeera is like, there's a gun battle, like there was not a gun battle when you target a music festival with a bunch of 19-year-old civilians. And again, it irks me because it's like you correctly identify that the level of civilian casualties is unacceptably high, but then to pretend that the other side didn't deliberately seek out and also kill civilians. Like if it's bad, it's bad. And again, this is the sort of hypocrisy that drives me absolutely bananas. And you can see there's a ton of coverage here in the New York Times coverage in favor of Israel, right? Like very, very light coverage of the Israeli operations in Gaza, right? You see at the very bottom, what about the death toll in Gaza? And at least they acknowledge that there have been 11,000 people in the territory since the war broke out. The tally did not distinguish between militants and civilians. But they acknowledge, to their credit, that there were 5,000 minors and 3,000 women who are generally considered statistically extremely unlikely to be fighters. Legally, right? You're like, I don't even know. I mean, if you have like a 17-year-old who takes up arms, I think they can be considered a combatant. But it's still, you see, it gets buried. It doesn't get infographics or salacious pictures or anything like that, and it's buried way in the story. So, just again, I'm trying to give you guys the best stats, but you see how hard it is to get real information. And who knows what other information is being buried in these articles, right? Or buried and not covered at all. But let's talk about another even more troubling development, at least troubling to me, and that is the Iranian militia, Syrian militias backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps have been targeted by U.S. forces. Here's a statement from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. This is as of the 12th, yesterday. U.S. military forces conducted precision strikes today on facilities in eastern Syria used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iranian-affiliated groups in response to continued attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria. Strikes were conducted against a training facility and safe house near two cities. And the president acknowledges no higher priority than the safety of U.S. personnel and directs the action to make clear that the U.S. will defend itself, its personnel, and its interests. Here's what's interesting. You might remember the first set of strikes, the U.S. took pains to acknowledge that it wasn't seen as an escalation within Israel. And you can really see in that short, succinct statement that the Secretary of Defense is losing patience, right? It is more curt. It is more direct. And the fact is that the U.S. knows probably the first strikes didn't slow the attacks. The second strike's not going to slow the attacks. And these are, of course, military operations targeting U.S. military. So the U.S. military has been restrained in that it's targeted what it strongly believes are training camps and munitions dumps. And I think this is important because the U.S. is modeling how you can conduct these operations in a different way, right? Now, I wanted to point out some other news that's troubling and annoying. First off, according to an Israeli newspaper, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved regulations allowing the closure of foreign media outlets. Not a great look. Not a great look for the Israelis because, well, what do you have to hide, right? Now, obviously, you and I know that the images of whole Gazan apartment buildings getting squashed is pretty bad. That's a bad look. It's more than a bad look. It's just bad. Those are people's homes, right? There's 3 million Gazans. A tiny, 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 tiny fraction of them are actual Hamas fighters. And a lot of them, as we saw, tens of thousands getting caught in the crossfire. So instead of actually trying to enact a level of discipline required to conduct this sort of operation, they're preferring to simply silence critics, which is also pretty screwed up. That's a twisted way of doing things. Of course, apparently also UN headquarters announcing that a large number of their staff have been killed in a bombing of the Gaza Strip, which, again, you get stories like that, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I see why Israel is in a hurry to close down all of these foreign outlets. But let's here's something else that I thought was interesting and worth talking about is the continued battle for the Al-Shifa hospital. It sounds like Israel might be starting to get the message. They fired smoke bombs, which is important because they're not lethal weapons, in the battle for the hospital. There's even Netanyahu claims that they offered to bring fuel to the Al-Shifa hospital, but Hamas refused to receive it. And this is sort of the story here, is that increasingly Israel is realizing that they can't fight their war. The international community is more dialed into these conflicts than ever before, and international pressure is more important than ever before. That's how Ukraine found out that it wasn't about when Ukraine spun things as being not just a distant European country fighting another Eastern European country, but when the images of the home country of Ukrainians being invaded by their bigger, badder, bullying neighbor, and it was combined with good messaging, you realize that getting the international public on your side goes a long way. And the Israelis are waking up to this fact that they can't simply, even though Hamas made the choice to station large numbers of troops and munitions in a hospital that serves civilians, the civilians Hamas is ostensibly responsible for protecting, right? In the battlefield, it's everyone's job to protect civilians. So just because Hamas has chosen this hospital as to make this hospital a battlefield, Israel also, right? It's like square dancing. Both parties have to meet on the dance floor, and both parties have decided that this hospital is a place where they need to have their showdown. And Netanyahu is starting to wake up to the fact that maybe, even though it's known to be Hamas's headquarters, it may just not be worth it to go to war at this hospital. They may be better served to just surround it and say, hey, we have ambulances standing by. The Israeli military is going to get every patient and doctor out of this hospital. And then we're going to go in and we are going to go room by room, door by door, tunnel by tunnel, and we are going to dig out every Hamas fighter. That would be the better humanitarian way to do it. But if Israel's smart, they'd release hours and hours of footage. They'd interview every one of those patients getting treated by Israeli medics, right? Getting brought to ambulances, escorted by tanks through this safe passage to southern Gaza to a hospital that can accommodate them. That's the kind of operation that would win Israel sympathy, right? And international support. But instead, right, they've chosen to turn it into a battlefield, playing directly into Hamas's hands. And finally, they're just starting to make these kind of almost sarcastic comments. They knew they weren't, that Hamas isn't going to let the Israelis waltz into the hospital, right? But they at least are trying. They at least realize that they have to have some kind of public diplomacy that makes them look like the good guys. And the thing is, the Israelis have all the tools they need to be the good guys, right? And it's kind of absurd. And you can see that they're being relatively effective in this operation. They're creeping into Beit Hanun, right? They're crossing into some of these high-density urban areas, right? They're somewhat successful at their operation, and I acknowledge that this is a level of success. Again, just remember the Iraq war timeline. The U.S. beat the Iraqi military in like 3 weeks and then spent the next, 17 years trying to squash out an insurgent movement in occupied Iraq. That's the direction I think this is going to go. So I'm not surprised that the Israeli military is successful at clearing these, or at least claiming that it's cleared these buildings. How much fighting is happening in these blue areas? I suspect actually quite a bit. But the Israelis realize that what the Israelis are only now realizing that what the Palestinians have known from the get-go, which is that the military success is almost secondary to the public opinion success. And the fact is, the Palestinians do a good job of getting their perspective out there that, the Israelis are big, the Palestinians are small. The Israelis have a lot of money, the Palestinians are broke. The Palestinians are trapped inside Gaza. The Israelis are the ones doing the trapping. And that narrative, right, the Israelis just don't care. They think that because they, like a lot of countries, work hard to exert influence in different aspects, just like the Egyptians worked hard to buy Senator Menendez. I think the Israelis work really hard to message through politicians and through certain, pro-Israeli or Israeli-leaning media outlets, like we just talked about with the New York Times. And that they're realizing that's not sufficient. It's not enough to have politicians who like you, and it's not enough to have major media outlets who support you, some of them. You need to do better public diplomacy, and they're finally getting awake to that reality. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Thank you so much. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. Also, I do deep dive analysis of the actual operations taking place here, especially Hamas has released some really crazy combat footage. If you want to see those deep dives, they're available on my premium site, combatvetnews.com. Works just like Patreon. I have these members with all these different tiers, but any one of these tiers is going to get you access to the members-only content, which includes my analysis, deep dives of combat footage, totally uncensored from Ukraine and from Gaza. So check us out, combatvetnews.com. See you in the next one. Cheers.